Thank you very much for those of you that are in the room today. As you may be aware, there's currently protests happening in the city and it's a complete gridlock, and there are a number of people that are stuck in traffic, in Ubers and on buses. So thank you for not taking that form of transport and getting here a little bit earlier so we're not talking to ourselves. But just be aware that people will filter through kind of as they come. Are we still good online, Bridget? Thumbs up, amazing. So welcome to everybody who's online and streaming in from various parts. Clearly you have no traffic problems. Didn't think that traffic would be the issue today. The last 2 years we've had COVID, so very relieved to dodge the COVID this morning, but clearly not the traffic. So I'm going to introduce Rowena Maguire, who is our Director for Centre for Justice. But I think we have a welcome to country that should be coming on first.
Balka be Balka, welcome in the language of the Yagara people. We acknowledge the Turrbal and Yagara peoples as the First Nation owners of the lands of where QUT now stands. For thousands of years, the Turrbal and Yagara people have gathered along the banks of Maiwa, the Brisbane River, to share their knowledge and stories. We pay our respects to their elders, laws, customs, and creation spirits. We recognise that these lands where QUT now stands have always been places of teaching, researching, and learning. We acknowledge the important role Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people play within our QUT community. From Moreton Bay, inland as far as the Great Dividing Range near Warwick and Toowoomba, as far north as the Caboolture River, including the lands around Brisbane City, Meanjin. Yura yura yinala, balka bi balka, nganguru nguru maramakoro nganya birali, nganya bayam. Welcome to the traditional country of the Turrbal and Yagara people.
Amazing. So I would just like to extend my acknowledgement of country as well, and pay my respect to elders past and present. And I'll invite Rowena to come up on stage.
Hi everybody, thank you for coming this morning to National Scams Awareness Week. This event is organised by the Centre for Justice and we are delighted to have our panellists here today for this conversation and we're looking forward to the conversation that will emerge. My job today is just to tell you a little bit about the Centre for Justice, which is the centre that's organising this event. So as you can see on the slide here, the centre has 4 main research themes which are highlighted within the small circles of this diagram. So these are themes related to global justice, gendered and institutional violence and justice, young people and justice and environment and social justice. Scams are issues that really perpetrate or sort of cross over many of these areas. And then around on the outside of this diagram here, we have some of the other topics that we focus on. So in particular here, our technologies and media focus and our victim, survivor and lived experiences are particular areas of strength that relate to what we're talking about today. The centre is a very collaborative centre. It's a centre that works closely with government, with not-for-profit sector, with international organisations, and we're really happy to have the kinds of conversations that we're having here today to sort of talk about these issues that are facing society. On your seat, you all have a briefing paper. So the C4J briefing paper series is a series that's been designed to take academic knowledge and put it in an accessible format. So these are generally smaller pieces of writing which are translating academic research for a broader audience. So these briefing paper series we have all available online and we've featured up on this slide here some of our research that is featured within that briefing paper series related to today's topic. So some of the briefing paper that's on your seat is to do in particular with romance fraud, but we've also got other briefing paper series which has been looking at romance fraud through dating applications and romance fraud in the fraud in the employment sector as well. Just to highlight really here that Cass here is of great interest. Cass's research is of great interest to the media, and she appears very frequently on the radio, within the conversation, and within print media as well, detailing her research. So if you're interested in staying up to date with all of the work that's going on in this sort of scams area, please follow QUT Centre for Justice on LinkedIn, and you'll get access to every time one of these stories is profiled within the media. I don't want to delay the conversation any further, so I'll now hand over to Cass.
I've awkwardly got two microphones right now. I'm just going to stand here for a moment. It is my privilege to invite you here today for National Scams Awareness Week. So it's a week that is close to my heart. For those of you who know me, my research has been focused on fraud for approximately 16 years now. So it's been a little while. In some ways it's changed, and in some ways it's entirely the same, which is both frustrating, sad and challenging. But we are here today with this amazing group of powerhouse women, and I'm so privileged to be up here and for them all to have said yes. I was so incredibly excited when this happened. But we're here today to be talking about romance fraud in particular, I guess fraud more broadly. The theme for National Scams Awareness Week this year is Stop a Scam, Share a Story. Well, I think it might actually be the other way around. Share a story, stop a scam. And it's really important, I think, that we do talk about this, that we break down the shame and the stigma that's associated with fraud victimisation and try and give voice to people that have experienced this instead of the silencing that so many of them experience. So how we're going to do this today is that we're going to have essentially a conversation up here. We've got some questions. We're probably not going to get through all of them. There's a billion questions I'd love to ask every panellist, but we'll see how we go. We're going to go through until about 12:30 for the panel discussion. Towards the end, we will take some questions from the audience and from online. So if you do have particular questions, if you're in the room, write them down, think about them. If you're online, feel free to post them, and Bridget will be monitoring them. But otherwise, for those of us in the room, as I said, there will be people coming in as different streets open and buses arrive, etc. But we just have to make the most of the situation, make the most of the time we've got together and talk about this really important topic. So I am just quickly going to introduce all members of the panel, and I'm going to sit down and we're going to start chatting. So firstly, Stephanie Wood is an award-winning writer whose work appears in publications including The Good Weekend magazine, The Age and Sydney Morning Herald, The Guardian and Vogue. She's the author of Fake, a startling true love story of love in a world of liars, cheats, narcissists, fantasists and phonies, which has been adapted for a major Paramount Plus TV series, which may be streaming into some of your lounge rooms as we speak. Stephanie's worked as an editor at the newspapers, including The Independent, The Daily Mail in London, the Asian Wall Street Journal in Hong Kong. She's a former editor of the Age Good Food Guide and the Age Epicure section, and she writes a popular weekly Substack newsletter called Vamp, which is underpinned by her belief in the power of creativity, curiosity, and adventure. So it's so delightful to have you here. I also have props. So this is the book, this is Stephanie's book, and this is all the points that I might raise today. We also, for Stephanie and Tracy, who I'll mention in a moment, we do have QT Bookstore who are here. And if you're interested in what we talk about today and don't have a copy of these two fabulous books, you can purchase them here from the QT Bookstore, and ask nicely, Stephanie and Tracy will sign them for you as well. So moving on to Tracy, thank you for coming. So Tracy is an author and keynote speaker and a senior marketing executive. Over the last 25 years, Tracy has had extensive exposure to startups, large corporations and tech brands in Australia and the US, including Virgin Mobile, eBay, GoDaddy and Afterpay. In 2019, Tracy made a name for herself as Hamish McLaren's famous Last Victim, thanks to her role in the Australians podcast, Who the Hell is Hamish? Today, Tracy writes and speaks publicly about intimate fraud, romance scams, white-collar crime, victim mindsets, resilience, and humanity's need to rethink how we trust. Tracy's living her mission of embracing and normalising vulnerability while helping others heed the warning signs of intimate and financial betrayal. So the last victim here is Tracy's first book. So then we've got Dr. Phoebe Hart, who's an inspiring film educator, globally acknowledged expert, bridging academia and industry as a pro-academic. A successful documentary filmmaker and widely published researcher, her interdisciplinary outputs investigate creative practice and diversity on and off screen, and screen education to disrupt representations of marginalised groups. In 2024, she published a monograph entitled Crafting Contemporary Documentaries and Docu-Series for Global Screens, Documania, which she has a copy of. You can just do this moment, thank you. That's it. Which explores the industrial, and personal challenges faced by filmmakers in bringing the current worldwide craze for documentary films and series to screens small and large. And then last but absolutely not least is my School of Justice colleague, Dr. Laura Vitus. She's a senior lecturer in the School of Justice here at QUT. Her research focuses on how technology is used to facilitate gendered, sexual and domestic violence, and her work also examines the role of mediated sites in justice seeking for violence against women, with a particular focus on informal justice seeking and true crime. So from that, you can tell what a powerhouse of knowledge we have up here, and I'm really excited to just dive in. So I do have a timer, which is going to keep us on track. So I'm going to set this now. So let's jump off. I'm going to take this microphone now, thank you. So I guess firstly, I've just given, the introduction to both of you, Stephanie and Tracy, but I was wondering if you could give us a quick summary of your experiences of deception, I guess, which is leading to today's discussion. So I might start with you, Stephanie, if that's okay.
Thank you. Am I on? Yes. I'm a journalist, and in 2014 I decided to venture into some online dating, reluctantly. I'd been single for a while, and I suppose that's the point at which you're quite vulnerable, isn't it, when you've been single for a while. I met a guy online called Joe. We'll call him Joe. I nearly used his real name then, and we've not done that publicly so far. That could have been a trap. I wasn't that into him initially, but I guess he wore my defences down, and within a fairly short amount of time, he was saying things to me to indicate that we had a future together, that specific things like, I see you in cooking for me, because I love to cook, so it's not as if it's a domestic servitude role or anything like that. I see you cooking for me, I'm seeing you with grey hair in my future. Things to hook me in to think that this was a relationship with promise and a future. He claimed to be a former architect who had moved into private equity for a while, then had become a property developer, and he said he had this little farm down in the southern tablelands of New South Wales. He told me he lived on the harbour in Sydney and had 2 children and a little boat moored down the back of his garden. He came across, at one point, some months into the relationship, he told me in a very sheepish manner, like, I have a disgusting amount of money. He almost whispered it. It was not something, he wasn't boasting about it, and I've never had a designer handbag in my life. I'm more interested in growing vegetables in a garden, so I wasn't interested in his money per se. It was him that I was interested in, and a future with him. But throughout the relationship, and tell me if I'm taking too much time to tell this story, I suffer some anxiety, as so many people do, and I was extremely anxious. There were things that didn't add up. I couldn't work out what was going on. He cancelled on me constantly, all the time, and there were always just these incredible excuses, things happening at his farm that he needed to attend to, or things going wrong with his kids because his ex-wife, he claimed, had a psychiatric disorder and was completely unreliable. or there was a business meeting, or there was this, or there was that. And so my levels of anxiety were just incredibly heightened. And to this day, I don't know whether that was my anxiety or my instinct talking, but he never asked me for money. I never gave him any money, and he never asked me for any money, and I never lost any money. And I kept saying to myself, well, you know, I don't know what this could be about. And the worst I could imagine was that he was seeing other women, which did in fact prove to be true, but it was a very minor part of what happened, what proved to be true about the man. And I was with him about 14 months before my mental health was just, I was a mess. I couldn't get out of bed. I was just beside myself, incapable probably of any sort of rational thinking other than that I really needed to get out of this relationship. And eventually dumped him. And the moment I dumped him, I should just go backwards and say I did meet his children. That was true. I did do, of course, some Googling of him, not as much as I should have. I actually sat, I don't know whether any of you are familiar with the Sydney investigative journalist Kate McClimate, who's a major Sydney, I sat near her at work and she was a friend, and she and another investigative journalist at the Sydney Morning Herald, where I was on staff at the time, was saying, let's do some investigations into this guy. And if you've seen the television series, the line in there where Birdie, the character that plays me, Asha Keddy, says, this is a love story, not an investigation. I pretty much said exactly that. I knew the searches that I could have done to find out whether a lot of what he was telling me was true. But I actually only did some fairly lightweight Google searches which proved that he told me his grandfather was a very well-known business person. That was true. I discovered evidence that he lived in this harbourside suburb. In fact, his driver's licence that I saw one day had the address on it. I met the kids. So there were certain things that I discovered later were true. I knew were true, but after I dumped him, that's when I really started investigating him. And at the time, it wasn't for an article or a book or a television series. It was just because I needed to know what the hell have I just been with. And he turned out to be bankrupt. Now, I could have done a bankruptcy search like that and I would have known within a minute. He wasn't the wealthy man he said he was. It turned out he had lived in this house on the harbour, but his wife had got the house in the divorce. She wasn't crazy. If I'd done a property search, I could have established that he was not on the title deeds of the house. He turned out to have a criminal record for fraud, which would have been much more... I actually was only able to establish that through Kate at work. Otherwise, that would have been impossible evidence to find in the public record. And he had left a trail of damage through his life with both business partners and other romantic partners. He was seeing at least one other woman while I was with him, who I eventually met and talked to extensively. And even though we've never named him, he has actually been named in the Sydney Morning Herald, but not in something I've written. People recognise all my stories, and the book, of course, were gone. A defamation lawyer went over them very closely. But even so, people were able to identify him. He's never sued. We've never had a legal issue. But a lot of family, old ex-friends of his, ex-business partners, people who'd done business dealings, contacted me about this guy. And, I mean, I could write another book now about his behaviour over 2, 3, 4 decades. He broke one of his, just bankrupted one of his business partners, who also lost his architectural... Very boring, not boring, but long, complicated stories. But effectively, this guy is just one out of the box. And I found him. Was so lucky. So lucky.
It's a treasure you never thought you'd get.
I never thought I'd get that treasure. I wanted to write a book my whole life, but not this one. And nor did I expect it would be made into a television series, which is on your television screens right now. Star Asha Keddy as me. So that's kind of I suppose, some icing on the cake, although it's still super weird. So that's my story.
Yeah. I mean, I certainly have questions about that, which we'll get into a little bit later. But I might come to you, Tracy. Can you share with us, I guess, just some of the details around your story, which does have some similarities to what Stephanie's just said?
Quite a lot of similarities. So it was a couple of years later, early 2016. I had been separated from my husband for just over a year, and I thought I was ready to start dating again. And I was working a really big job at eBay in the city. I had a 5-year-old, I was single parenting. But I guess I wasn't looking for another husband, or I wasn't looking to have more children. I was just looking for someone who wanted to do things with me, some companionship, someone who had similar values and interests. And it was slim pickings back in 2016 on the dating apps. And anyway, I swiped right on a man called Max Tavita, and he was 41, a chief investment officer for a family office in the city. And we connected and we met, and we did have similar interests and what seemed like similar values. And we started a very much an in real life relationship, which lasted nearly a year and a half. And we took holidays together. He met my mum and my daughter, and we just had this very open, honest, and what felt like a very trusting and respectful relationship. And throughout that time, there were countless, I'm going to say hundreds of conversations about his line of work, which was finance, investing for some of the wealthiest families in Australia. And this was just kind of, I guess, the rhetoric, like it was just the conversations that happened over and over again. And it wasn't until mid-July 2017 I woke up one morning to a Crime Stoppers video of an unidentified man being arrested outside of his Bondi Beach apartment. And his face was all blurred out, but of course, without a shadow of a doubt, I knew that that was my boyfriend, Max Tavita. Except it wasn't Max Tavita, it was Hamish McLaren, who is one of Australia's most notorious con men, and he had been arrested for swindling $7.6 million from 15 victims in Australia, and I happened to be his last victim. So he stole my life savings, $317,000. I guess in the process also stole my ability to trust. And I spent the next sort of year and a half trying to piece it together with very, very little information. The police wouldn't talk to me because, of course, it was a legal issue. The authorities wouldn't talk to me because it was a legal issue. His friends and family were very much Team Hamish. And so I was sort of trying to piece together this world. I had to unpick the last 18 months of my life with the police. I had to continue to work. I was still parenting. There was a lot going on. And it wasn't until I met Greg Bearup, who is an investigative journalist for The Australian, that things started to become clear to me. He met me, he heard my story. He came to Hamish's plea hearing where Hamish pled guilty. And that day we got a document which outlined the 15 victims and the $7.6 million. And that's where he said, I want to do a podcast, let's do a podcast. And I was like, okay. And so I was one of the characters, obviously, within the podcast. That's where it started. But as the police were unpicking the $7.6 million and the 15 victims that had come forward, Greg had figured out and found that it was closer to $80 to $100 million globally. And that's, I guess, where things started to fall into place for me. So we might leave it there for now.
Well, thank you. So we are in National Scams Awareness Week, and I have a problem with the word scams, but that's probably a soapbox I'll get on at a different point. But if we think about romance fraud, it is all about lying and cheating and deception, and in most circumstances it's for financial gain. So we do know some of the stats that over $200 million specifically through romance fraud was reported lost by Australians last year. I think that's a gross underrepresentation, simply because there was $1.3 billion in investment schemes, and we know that a lot of romance and investment is kind of culminating together at the moment around what's called romance baiting in an Australian context, and another term which I'll probably cover a little bit later. But in reading, I guess, both of your books, I was struck, but certainly not surprised, around just the level of deception that both Joe and Hamish used. And I think it's really difficult sometimes for people outside to kind of recognise the level of complexity, the level of sophistication, just the level of engagement and just the time. Because 14 months for you, Stephanie, it was 16 months, for you, Tracy. That's not just kind of a quick get in there, represent yourself, ask for money, break someone's heart and get out of there. So I was just wondering if you could perhaps share with us some of the examples that in hindsight you've reflected upon around some of those techniques and around some of the ways that you were deceived by Joe and by Hamish? So,
this probably goes without saying, but something I should preface it all with is that there are romance scams, right, that where the victim never ever meets the person, whereas both in Tracy and my situation, we spent physical dating time with these people. So I don't know, maybe later you could talk about what the differences are, because obviously there will be a lot, but we both spent time. And so I think by starting with that, what I mean to say is that when you're in the throes, and for my book I did a lot of research about this, that when you're in the throes of love, particularly new love, your brain is not behaving in the way it should be. Neurotransmitters and hormones are just going berserk, and your frontal lobe, which is is responsible for executive function, is not working as it should be. So you're at a disadvantage from the very word go. And there's also, as I discovered from research when I was writing my book, all sorts of cognitive biases, that it's so easy in hindsight to see all the pieces, but when you're actually on the ground and your brain's not behaving as it really should, it's harder, so hard to see the pieces. In terms of I think the thing that characterised my relationship, and I suspect you'll say the same, Tracy, is the level of detail with which he embellished his stories. It was just quite extraordinary. And in fact, when I later met the woman he was seeing at the same time, she joked that he must have had a whiteboard with to the table, what he was telling me and what he was telling her, so that his stories didn't get mixed up. And I also, for my book, interviewed his former business partner, who had been his best friend and his best man at his wedding, and they'd been in business for 20 years. And my ex, Joe, completely did the dirty on him, and his ex-business partner said he had a notebook where he wrote absolutely everything down. So it seems clear to me that he had to keep across all this detail that he was talking about. I think Hamish was obviously far more sophisticated, I think, because I don't think my ex earned an awful lot of money from his scamming. But he'd sit at breakfast with the Financial Review and talk about, oh yes, the Chinese delegation, I've got to go and meet them in Tasmania to look at this wind farm. And he'd talk so knowledgeably about things. Hindsight, of course, he's just reading it in the newspaper. But, there were things he said that he couldn't have just read in the newspaper. And then he's telling me, I'm flying to Tasmania this morning to meet them. And then he's texting me during the day to give me snippets of information about the meetings that he's in. He would I call them 3-act plays, because it would never just be, I can't see you this weekend. It would start out, I don't think I can see you this weekend, and then that first act would build, no, I definitely can't see you, this is what's happening. My dog's been bitten by a snake was a classic one. He was down on his alleged farm. My dog's been bitten by a snake, I don't think I'm going to be able to make it. And then Act 2, the dog's going to die, I'm at a vet, I'm cradling the dog, I won't be able to get up there tonight for dinner. The next day I'm moving the dog, I think the dog's got a hope of living, I'm moving him to another vet, an old friend. Then later in the day, I'm going to sit with this old friend, we had a falling out and now we're going to make up together, and I hope you'll forgive me, I'll be up on Sunday instead. So by this stage, 2 days late for a dinner date. And then on the Sunday, I'll be up by lunchtime, and then I don't hear from him, and it's finally dinner time by the time he arrives. And I'm getting texts the whole weekend to tell me about the condition of the dog, and how he's talking about old times with his friend. And now, why would anyone disbelieve that? When I discovered his other woman via some social media searching, I went back through her posts from the time that he and I were together, and there he was away for a weekend with this other woman, the whole weekend, swimming in a pool, sitting on a deck reading, no sign of his dog, texting me every so often, just, better just keep her happy and send her a text telling her what's going on with the dog that's God knows where. So it's the level of detail that was always just so intense.
Yeah. What about you, Tracy?
Very similar, actually. I think the reason I wrote the book was because I needed 75,000 words to explain how something like this could happen to someone like me, I guess. And it's so nuanced and it's so detailed and it's so layered. And to the point where, you're right, if Hamish had have knocked on my door 2 weeks after we met and said, you know, hey Trace, hand over your superannuation and your tech shares and off I go, I would have said bugger off. But he created what I can only describe as a movie. You know, there were sets, there were scenes, there were characters where it all kind of fit together over a long period of time, to the point where I 100% thought he was the best person to invest my money, because there were the fake documents that he'd provide. There was the weekly report that he'd send out to his family office clients that I got a copy of. There were the fake investment returns of the money that he was investing for me. There were the phone calls that I overheard with actual people on the other end of the phone, talking about the price of gold or the trades or whatever. There were the constant messaging and the commentary that he had on the financial state of the world and Trump's antics overnight and how they were going to impact the economy. And there were the Bloomberg monitors in his apartment. There were the letters that I picked up from his mailbox addressed to Max Tavita, and of course that's not a real person, that he had created and planted there, knowing that I would grab them on my way up to his apartment. And, we would go to the city in the morning and he'd put on his suit, he'd drive us in, we'd drive into the street where he apparently worked. He'd drop me off at street level and say, just go down Hunter Street, down to eBay. I've got to park 4 floors under. Thanks so much. Great. See you. Talk to you later. And he didn't have an office. He didn't have a job. I think he just turned the car around, went back to Bondi and put his board shorts back on. There was so much time and effort and detail. And the thing about Hamish was, nobody else knew him as Max Tavita. I had this character for myself. He was a barrister for someone else. He was a businessman for someone else. He was advising for Lisa Ho's business and, convincing her business advisors about their, strategies and things. So, I never saw any notebooks, but I, on some level, without giving him too much credit, an incredible level of intelligence to keep these different stories going. And I think the other thing, just finally to mention, the stories, when I recount them, they seem so ridiculous. And I listen to myself saying them and I think, oh my God, why did you believe that? Like, that's crazy. But what's important to note is that in a relationship that goes over a very long period of time, the stories come in sentences at a time. And something is mentioned, oh, my parents died. Oh, I'm sorry about that. Oh yeah, and what do you do for work? Conversations move on quite quickly and you get these snippets of information that when I put them together in retrospect, they seem like the craziest stories. But when they're presented to you a sentence at a time over a period of nearly a year and a half, it's like, this is what I guess coercive control and grooming is. It's these death by 1,000 cuts that have you believe that it's something that it's not. But because you're there and, there's a beautiful saying, when you're wearing rose-coloured glasses, all the red flags are just flags. You don't see it for what it is. And, I think they're the things that are really hard to explain to someone who's never been through something like this. And this is why I love conversations like this. I love long-form content. I love podcasts. I love books and documentaries as well, because, it allows you to explain in detail how something like this can happen, which sort of removes that idea that you're just a silly girl that, made a mistake.
Can I just add quickly? I don't know whether I've got that. You were talking about the phone calls where you overheard him talking to a real person. I never heard those. I heard phone calls in which he'd be on the phone talking to someone about one thing or another that made it sound like he was super convincing. Later I realised he was a master of just talking to himself and there was no one else on the other end of the phone at all. So they just use all these incredible tricks, and it's just tragic, really. Like, imagine living your life like that. But that's what they do.
Yeah, and I think that's what is so... I'm not sure what the proper adjective is, but just reading through both of it is just that level of detail that both men were kind of committed to and engaged in. And I think it's really important, just because of what you just said, Tracy, about when you hear yourself now, it does sound ridiculous, and there are the red flags that potentially when you're looking back in hindsight, reframing, you can see. And that's one of my favourite parts of your book, actually, that part at the end where Tracy's got a list of truths, and one is that red flags are just flags when you've got rose-coloured glasses on, and I just love that expression. And if we think about...
They're invisible flags at the time.
Yeah.
And that's an interesting concept too, because if they were red flags, you would never have done what you did.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. I mean, I say that all the time in my presentations, that people don't wake up in the morning kind of thinking I'm going to be a victim today, and people aren't looking for neon kind of flashing lights around their experience or this person they've met or the email that they've received. So we kind of in some ways expect there to be these neon flashing lights that will recognise it, but when it's so entrenched in everyday conversations and everyday interactions, you mentioned, Stephanie, a lot of romance fraud victims, particularly I guess that I've had contact with and interviewed, haven't necessarily met the person that they've been defrauded by. So their communication has been predominantly in an online environment. It's been through phone calls, text messages, emails, any other communication platform. But it's still the same in terms of the techniques. So the grooming techniques that you both have experienced, the psychological abuse, coercive control that you articulate at various points in here and have mentioned, just kind of that ongoing control and manipulation. And I think for those who haven't met their offender in person, it just speaks even more to the strength of those techniques because there's no geographical proximity. So for so many people, their offender is on the other side of the world, but still through these same kind of techniques and tactics, the offender is able to get the victim to do things that they ordinarily wouldn't do. And I think that's the thing we need to understand better around fraud, particularly, I guess, thinking about romance and kind of intimate partner fraud. But I'm going to take it up a level, and I'm going to come to you, Laura. We certainly, anyone who's looked at podcasts or series or television in general, we certainly have an obsession or a strong interest in true crime. So I guess I was just wondering, Laura, what are your thoughts around the appeal of true crime and why are people drawn to this type of genre?
Yeah, there's quite a lot of motivations. A lot of my work has focused on the experiences and perspectives of the audience, so the people who are listening to true crime podcasts in particular. And there are the ones that I think that are possibly more apparent. So the desire for an effective story, a story that has deep emotional resonance, that people can either listen to and feel intrigue or powerful emotions like horror, shock. And that's often tied to the stories that we see published within true crime, and in some cases the way in which true crime focuses its attention on specific stories. But there are also other motivations that people have that relate to the way in which contemporary true crime, I think, calls to listeners as more participants in the story, that allows them to feel as though they are involved in the story, as either thinking through what is happening. That's something that listeners identify as being something that they value, thinking through how a story is functioning, who's involved, what is happening, that sort of participatory aspect, which is a sort of broadly situated in the changing media landscape where we don't just, consume information, we also produce it as well. So around true crime there also tends to be these other sites where people will go online and discuss, maybe they've got a true crime Facebook page or a subreddit dedicated to a specific narrative. So there's the participatory aspect of it as well. Other motivations relate to people who have lived experiences feeling a sense of solidarity, listening to stories that resonate with them. My work focuses on, violence against women, and some women who participate in Facebook groups talk about feeling as though they get to have a space to discuss sort of gendered experiences of crime. But one other aspect I think it's important to recognise is the motivations around justice and the sense that both listening to true crime, specifically a podcast that relates to my work, can be a form of instrumental and also expressive justice, meaning that the podcast or the text can maybe have a practical impact in people's lives, whether that's a criminal legal impact or any other impact, that it can affect some kind of change. But also that just listening now, I think, is recognised by audiences as a form of justice, whether that's memorialisation, whether that's listening and hearing someone's story that resonates with people who consume true crime as a form of justice in and of itself, and that's recognised as an important motivation. And certainly in my work, I've asked people to, select podcasts that they would like to listen to, and they do tend to select podcasts where they feel like maybe listening will bring justice to a victim of crime or a victim survivor. So there are a range of different motivations that we see why people are drawn to these texts, some more enduring for true crime and also some more contemporary and relating to the way in which consumers consume or listen to media now.
Thank you. Coming to you now, Phoebe. If we think about, I guess, just recently since probably 2019, 2020, we've had Dirty John, we've had The Tinder Swindler, we've had Inventing Anna, we've had Bad Vegan. There's kind of a list of different series that have been focused around fraud. I feel for me, Tinder Swindler was I feel it was my moment, because it was my moment where my family and friends, for the first time at that stage, probably over a decade, had any idea what I'd been doing. In terms of my research and in terms of kind of what I was always talking about. I feel it kind of brought global attention to this discussion around fraud. Why do you think, Phoebe, as a filmmaker, as a documentary filmmaker, why do you think there is, a current interest and focus around these stories of deception?
Yeah, I guess it's sort of a couple of things happening all at once. There's people are sort of like going away from sort of like traditional television watching kind of thing, like cable cutting, and going to streaming platforms such as Netflix, etc. True crime is and has always been kind of a perennial topic of interest, I guess. But probably from COVID onwards really exploded because people were trapped at home watching TV, basically, sort of thing, on streaming, binging. And I think the seriality of platforms such as Netflix, where it's like, okay, just have to watch the next episode now, really lends itself well to fraud stories, because as both of you are saying, it's incredibly detailed information there that, and with so many twists and turns and revelations as you go. So from a screenwriting perspective, or just like, you even mentioned that it had 3-act structure kind of thing, it's kind of the perfect thing for filmmakers, whether they're non-fiction or fictional kind of thing, because, obviously there's a lot of based on true story kind of narrative treatments of fraud as well. So, but it is a very popular genre. I think even true crime is actually subgenreized. So you have murder, you have kind of cold case, you have missing persons, probably con artist / fraud / scam kind of thing is about the 4th most popular. But it sort of goes all the way down to like things like cults. So, cult documentaries are extremely popular as well now, sort of thing. Part of the research I did for the book was I interviewed the makers of The Tinder Swindler, the director Felicity Morris, who's based in the UK. But it's also the fact that story as well had an international dimension as well, like the not a protagonist, but the person that created the crime, Simon Levive, Israeli citizen, people from England, from parts of Europe kind of thing. And that's sort of like the Netflix formula kind of thing. It's internet-based because, it's about, he used Tinder, obviously, to entrap women and then sort of like, extract money from them, usually by kind of love bombing them straight away and getting them on a flight to some expensive, because he's apparently some wealthy individual who can, drop everything to go to Venice for a weekend or whatever kind of thing. So, but normally he was paying for that trip from a scam he'd just done with another victim just before that. So it's sort of one of those sort of stranger than fiction stories kind of thing. And I think within sort of like scam the scam subgenre, there's subgenres within that. So now we're seeing things like fertility scamming documentaries. So with The Man with 1,000 Kids kind of thing, for example, was a big hit. There's even corporate romance scamming kind of stories like the Madison Ashley story, which was, again, another huge hit on Netflix. So it's definitely something that we'll see more of coming forward kind of thing.
Yeah, thank you. I guess I kind of want to get into a little bit of a discussion about that now. So we know that there's an interest in this. We know that there's some documentaries that are happening. I did just watch the Ashley Madison one. And as with most things, I think I was talking to Tracy last night, Tinder Swindler. I don't watch it as the normal person. I watch it with a very different point of reference, and I yell quite loudly at my television. So it's not necessarily relaxing viewing for me. So I was yelling at my TV for Ashley Madison. But maybe Phoebe and Stephanie on this one, just thinking about the potential of an inherent kind of tension or conflict in making these shows and around, if they're based on true stories, and we know that Fake, the TV series, is based on your memoir, but it is still, I think, there is some creative license in that, and I know you've written about that recently. I might come to you first, Phoebe. How, from your interviews and your experience in approaching making a documentary or a series like this, how do people kind of balance the tension of staying true to the story or the lived experience against, I guess, the entertainment value and the need for it to be entertaining?
Yeah, that's a huge tension for practitioners of, if you're a filmmaker or any kind of storyteller, actually, kind of thing, because, we're sort of designed to hear a story in a particular way as human beings. Like we sort of, want, a perfect introduction, a setup of a character that has, something to lose or something to gain by taking a certain action, and then watching them go on that kind of journey kind of thing. I guess, documentary has been termed like it's like a creative treatment of actuality. It's not actually real. It's sort of like based on reality, even like a documentary to some degree, and it does have a creative element to it. But someone like Felicity Morris, who works for a kind of like quite a big production house in the UK, as I mentioned, Raw TV, they do a lot of this kind of like what they would call high-end, high-quality, like almost cinematic style kind of documentary film series for the big streamers and things like that. But even she was very, very conscientious about the way she worked with her participants. She understood that they actually were very embarrassed, about this story, that they were actually reluctant to tell it to some degree because it was like a difficult thing for them, but also that they were innovated, I guess, by energized to sort of tell the story because they thought it might prevent other people from having the same experience. And I think at the time that the film came out, he was still at large, basically. So he was still scamming. Tinder was still, allowing scammers to join without any verification process. So that had a huge impact, not only on him as a criminal, but also on the way that platform does its business and operations kind of thing, and how it sort of verifies people on the account now. So that's been huge impacts. So there can be really enormous impacts for telling that story, but to do it in a way that cares for participants so that they're not worse off for the experience is difficult. And I know that while Felicity was very excited that, it was a huge success, it generated heaps and heaps of publicity, like, other news stories, etc. sort of thing, it was, she could see that even in the comments and things like that, there was a lot of feedback, that, people were still misunderstanding why, or, what had happened. And
there's a lot of victim blaming in the narrative.
Basically, yes. Yeah. And that's sort of, when you put anything into the public realm, there's always going to be that kind of thing. I think the bigger picture stuff is that it was extremely successful in bringing attention to this subject matter that was, as you were saying earlier, stigmatized, and people were keeping it a secret, and that was allowing other perpetrators to persist, basically.
Yeah, I want to come back to the point you raised around reluctance in a moment, but just Stephanie, if you're very much in this at the moment with the series kind of streaming into our lounge rooms as we speak. Can you share with us kind of some of your thoughts and...
Don't look at the comments.
Absolutely don't look at the comments, but just around, I guess the word confronting, I think, is one that you've used in terms of seeing your story, but also kind of not seeing your story, and it's obviously you had some involvement and got to go on set with it being made. Can you share some of your thoughts about how you feel it being represented out there?
I don't think yet I hate the word process, but I don't honestly
it's
believe
still live. It's still happening.
Sunk in yet what's happened. I was saying to Tracy beforehand that I want to start moving away from this subject area. This may be the last time I ever speak on it publicly. It doesn't define my life, but it's been part of my life for way too long. It's only a very small part of my life. I do a whole lot of other work, and I'm frankly a bit sick of talking about it. Sorry to say that.
Absolutely. I understand that.
In terms of the series, I'm feeling intensely grateful that it was handled by a production company of the calibre that it was. And so the process, for those of you who don't know, is you write a book, lots and lots of books get optioned, which is basically a producer says, I'll pay you X, usually in the vicinity of about $1,500, to hold the option for the year, and in that year they will explore whether they can get funding for the project, whether they can attach, is the word they use, key talent, being whether that be a director, a cinematographer, or the actors. And when I signed that option after my book came out in 2019, I think I was just so excited to sign an option. At that stage, it just seemed hugely exciting, and I didn't think through any of the implications. And I realise now that it could have just been, I'm just going to swear then, but it could have been a complete and utter disaster. It could have been crippling to me as a person. It could have effectively ruined my life had it been handled by a less capable and less empathetic and sensitive team of people. And also, if you've seen it, I hope you'll agree that the production values are just exquisite. It's a beautiful production. The cinematography and the sound and the acting, it's just magnificent. So that's my first comment. I don't know whether that is answering your question, but I'm just so intensely grateful that it was handled by such people of such ability. That said, I don't love everything about it, nor would you expect to. I was fortunate enough to see the first drafts of the script probably about the middle of last year. I think I first saw them. And I read the first 2 pages, I think, on one day, and I nearly vomited. I wasn't very happy at all because I'd never read a script before. And reading a script is such a different thing, such a different exercise from reading a book. It's so one-dimensional, whereas the finished product of a film or a TV series is this magnificent 3-dimensional thing, and you can't, when you're not experienced, see that on the page. And there were things that made me just so unhappy about it. And I think I put it away for about 3 weeks and I could not look at it. And eventually I heard from the producer saying, Stephanie, what do you think? What's going on? And I went back to it. A couple of friends calmed me down, and I was allowed to give feedback. So I was able to, we eliminated completely one character, someone that was close to me, that I was having a slightly difficult relationship with at the time, who had been portrayed in a way that I thought they would loathe. That character disappeared, so they were so accommodating in that. And I made various comments on the script, some of which they took on board, some of which they didn't. I guess the things that I remain unhappy about, nothing can be done now, of course, they inserted red flags, blinding red flags, in episodes that I never had. I never had these red flags. Of course I had some red flags, but not these ones. Like, for example, in the second episode, the character Asher Ketty plays, reaches out to someone that knows Joe, the guy, and the woman says, run, as in get away from him. I never had that warning. And when I saw that, and the scripts change so much from their first incarnation to what you see on screen. They're changing. Apparently David Wenham, who plays Joe, is famous for this, that he changes the script as he's delivering the dialogue on set. And when I was on set last year, the producer made some comment, oh, there David goes again, changing the words. So what I saw middle of last year was not the final version, and I didn't know about that run in episode 2. And when I saw that, it was like, no, I didn't get that doing? And also there's an episode in which she tries to help him get money. I never tried to get money for my ex. But that's why not to look at the comments, because of course you know immediately that that's where the commenters on various, if there's an article about this, the commenters are going to go, oh, she was a stupid woman. And they're not knowing the nuance and the sentences that are delivered over so very long. But it's television, isn't it? It's entertainment. My story is entertainment.
Yeah, and I guess just along those lines, coming back to this idea of reluctance, because I know in your book, Tracy, when you were considering doing the podcast, you did get feedback from family and friends kind of warning you not to do it, the fact that it may kind of ruin your life type of thing. How did you wrestle with those thoughts and feelings before choosing to kind of go public?
Yeah, well, I thought about it for over a year. I was sort of in this, what I can only describe as a shame hole for over a year. And when I met Greg, he was obviously so fascinated, and in telling him my story, I thought the intention was he would write an article in the Weekend Australian, and he did that. But then, of course, as we sort of built our relationship, we went along to the plea hearing and he found out more. But that first article was, I think I sent it to my mum, who's here today, and my best friend. And they were both like, don't do it. I'm really worried. And I had to really consider that because I had a child to consider. At this point too, not many people knew what had happened. I'd kept it very, very close. And of course, I didn't really know the full extent. The process through the courts took so long. And so for me, it was an exposure of the whole story, which could have impacted my career, of which, I'd lost my life savings, like it was my only financial lifeline. So I was scared about that. Obviously, reputational damage. I was still feeling an incredible amount of shame. And in working with Greg, and as he was sort of rolling out his investigation, I just felt this sense of, I'd never heard a story like this before, in the way that it ended up being told. And I just thought, maybe if I tell my story, and I told Steph this when we met a few months ago, one of the reasons I actually said yes to Greg was because I'd read Steph's book. And she had mentioned throughout the book that when she came forward and wrote the article for the Sydney Morning Herald originally, the amount of women that had come to her and said, this happened to me, or I can relate to this, or you've released me from these emotions I've felt for all this time. And I had that in my mind as well, actually, and that's when I decided to do it. And, I had a very similar experience as soon as I had spoken to Greg. The article was in the Weekend Australia and the podcast was launched, of which my story is the first episode. The amount of people that came to me, and strangers, of course, but also people that I've known for 15, 20 years. A girlfriend of mine who said, my parents lost their superannuation in a massive fraud. And I'm like, how is it we've never had this conversation? Like, this is such a big thing that's happened to your family. She said, we just don't talk about it. And even to this day, like every day I get someone reaching out to me on some sort of platform saying their story or how they knew Hamish or something similar and how much comfort it's given them. And I'm so grateful that I did tell the story because, if it just helps one person, then it's been worth it for me. But also then there's the change that occurs through, and that's what I'm doing now in terms of, my career is advocating for victims who haven't found their voice yet, working with government, working with organisations on solutions to scams and fraud. I mean, the story is the story, but there's so much work to be done. And if I can assist to do that, to keep us all safer, make us all more financially resilient, especially our seniors, our older community who are very vulnerable, then for me that's a positive outcome. There's been some level of purpose in my predicament.
Thank you. I think one of the, biggest challenges in this space is that shame and stigma and the fact we don't talk about it. And that's why I think the theme for this year's National Scams Awareness Week is so important for us to be sharing these stories and, finding solidarity in kind of people's experiences. Coming to you, Laura, when we think about the language that we use in the media and when we think about language, how we describe fraud, but also there's obviously similar challenges with how we describe interpersonal violence. Mm-hmm. Can you share with us, some of your thoughts and expertise around, the power of language and the impact it has?
Yeah, I think one of the common themes that have come up here is about the propensity for victim blaming and how the way in which stories are told can contribute to that. So one of the sort of broader guidelines that are available around, domestic and family violence and sexual violence, like the Our Watch guidelines, pick up on some of these general themes. So things like making sure that the language is respectful, that victim survivors are treated with dignity, also that there is clearly a plan for what happens when a story is going to be released, considering the impact on people who are going to participate. But one of the broad points that's raised in that is about understanding context, telling and providing a full understanding of the matters that are being discussed, which I think is something that you picked up on, that stories and media representations that don't address the full account of people with lived experience, the drivers, are a core issue. So those are the kinds of things I think we need to be mindful of. And also the use of, disempowering images, disempowering language, victim-blaming language are all sort of common themes I think that have been picked up on.
Thanks for that. Tracy and I have been talking about headlines of, her story. And I have a particular headline which I want to share because I think it picks up exactly on some of the points that we've been talking about and that Laura's just mentioned. But I don't know which publication this came from, but the headline is Tracy's dashing investor boyfriend conned her out of $317,000. She shares the red flags she missed as a warning to other women. So, that's the headline of your story. And just really illustrates some of the challenges we have with the media and trying to overcome some of the way that it's portrayed. If we think about, the role of media, what can we do? Because, it's very brave of both of you to come and to put yourself out there publicly and to talk about this and become, in some ways, the public face of this. And I know both of you detail in your books just the number of people that have reached out to you across the globe who have had similar experiences. And I know myself, being an academic in this space, I'm quite easily found on Google. And I also receive these heartbreaking emails from people globally who've had some experience, lost a lot of money, find my email address and email me to see if there's anything that I can do. How do you cope with, how do you cope in that position when you receive this kind of ongoing stream of emails from people that kind of share with you their stories and perhaps are seeking help? How do you cope with that personally?
I think I felt initially, because this has been going on for years for me now since the book since my first article about this came out in 2017, I felt just hugely honoured that people were sharing their stories, and they shared them in great detail, like pages of information and emails that they sent to me. They didn't know me apart from the fact that I'd written this article. And I did my best to reply to every last one of them. For some years I spent hours every week responding to people and there's so little you can say really. And I suspect yours might be slightly different. I was hearing from women who hadn't necessarily lost lots of money. So they were identifying with the story of someone who had just presented themselves as someone that they were not over a long period of time, and that had proved to be really devastating for them. In latter years, I just can't respond to them all. I just can't. I'm a freelancer and not earning a huge amount of money, and I just can't. So I now have an out of office on that I feel guilty about, and I, put the Lifeline number there and put there's a centre for ethics in Sydney that will help people with queries, and I put that number down there and just say, I'm overwhelmed. I can't get back to you individually. I'm so sorry. Every time I see one, I just think there can't be more out there, because it's like, I feel as if I've had thousands now over the years, and it's like, surely I've heard from every woman out there that's had one of these experiences. And then another one arrives, and then another one arrives. And since the television series came out, more
You're
are
getting new
arriving.
wave now coming through.
Yeah, exactly. Every time there's new publicity about it. So it just seems inexhaustible, which makes me really, really sad.
Yeah. What about you, Tracy?
Yeah, similarly, I receive a lot of messages. For me, I do respond to most of them, not all of them. I generally just say thank you so much for sharing your story. And, you know, there was one particular incident when I had done the podcast and I was writing the book, and I was sitting at dinner with a woman who was in her mid-70s, and she had lost her divorce settlement when she was in her early 40s. So it had been about 35 years, and her grown-up children were sitting either side of us, and she's telling me this story, and tears are rolling down her face, and she told me that she had never told anybody. So in 35 years, she had held on to this story, and it was because of the podcast and because I had sort of been open with what happened to me that she felt a level of comfort that she could share that story. And the children were sort of like, how do we not ever know this, Mum? Like, you know, we knew something had happened, but we didn't know. And, you know, she just... that for me was a perfect example of the power in sharing a story. And, you know, she still feels very ashamed about it. She doesn't talk about it broadly because it's so private for her. But 35 years, I mean, that's a long time to hold on to something and feel ashamed about. And so the stories that I hear and experiences like that, for me, just fuel my fire to keep going. And I'm pretty good at compartmentalising, so I just kind of, you know, I listen, and I'm very compassionate and empathetic. There are some people who are really desperate to get their money back. Unfortunately, in most of these cases where you've lost money, and specifically when you've never met your perpetrator and it's gone online, the chances of getting money back are very, very slim. I think there is a big gap in victim support in the way that we handle victims of fraud and scam, and people have lost money. It's not always clear what your steps are. So that's something I try and help people with. But mostly it's just listening and saying thank you for sharing. And for me, if that's released them of some shame or some emotion that they have been holding on to, then that's worth it for me. And then it just again fuels my fire to keep going and to keep spreading awareness, educating people, making sure we're having the right conversations in the right forums. And yeah, that's what I'm doing with it.
I mean, I'm very similar to you in the fact that, I mean, the first interview that I did with a fraud victim, I think was 15 years ago, maybe 16 years ago. And I remember it very vividly. And for me, that was kind of a turning point in my research and in my career and in my life, I would say. And the emails that I get, there's nothing you can say. There's nothing, as an academic here in Brisbane, there's nothing I can do. I can't get their money back. But for me, it's kind of about responding to say thank you. And I think really importantly, it's about affirming the fact that they're not alone, affirming the fact that this isn't a unique experience or as unique as they may think it is because of the fact we don't talk about it, and to just affirm it wasn't their fault, the level of deception that this does sadly happen to so many others. So, but yeah, it's kind of an ongoing challenge. I realise we're kind of getting towards time now. I just perhaps want to open this up to the panel. Thinking about the future, I mean, sadly we know that this isn't going away, that you will likely still receive thousands more responses, more emails from people who have had these horrific experiences. We know that the amount of money lost every year is significant, and that's such an underrepresentation of the true costs around this. From, I guess, a media perspective, because we have been kind of talking about just media representations around fraud and around victims, what's one thing or kind of one thought that you think needs to change or that you hope will change into the future in this space, or one thing that we can do? What's your lasting thought as we kind of wrap this up before I open it up for some questions? Anyone brave?
I mean, if we talk about that specific example, and I've got hundreds of headlines written about me, some better than others. Firstly, I'm grateful that the media took the time to write about my story, and to use a very old term, the column inches that, that were granted when I released the book were far greater than I expected. So the richness of the stories is getting better. If it's just that one thing, it's putting the perpetrator at the heart of the headline. And often we don't know who the perpetrator is because they are from, scammer compounds in Southeast Asia or whatever it might be. But people won't report these scams. 30% is what the ACCC say are not reported. I personally feel it's a lot higher than that. But if the headline that's written about you when you come forward telling your story is about how stupid you are, there's no wonder people aren't coming forward. So if that was one thing that could happen, and the media could be more thoughtful about that, because we know violent crimes, the perpetrator is always the subject of the headline, whereas in financial crimes, it's often the silliness of the victim. So that's one thing that the media could do.
Thanks. Anyone else? Laura?
I think one of the sort of challenges moving forward about is sort of a common theme about how a story is being told, and one of the challenges I do think is the broader media landscape within which true crime is told. Now there is this enduring interest in it, and within the broader media landscape where you have a broader attention economy and short-form content and people willing and interested in true crime, making shorter, sharper, attention-grabbing, content on true crime without a consideration of all of what's just been mentioned here, I think is important to consider that the way in which true crime is being shared is in a far broader media landscape, and whether or not some of these issues are being attended to in that broader landscape, I think is worthy of consideration.
Thank you. Stephanie? Phoebe?
I'm not a lawyer, obviously, but for people who have been scammed romantically and not lost money, there's absolutely no legal redress. So if you lose money, there is some small chance that there could be legal redress depending on the circumstances, but there's just nothing. If you are lied to and deceived over the course of years, no redress at all. And there used to be a tort of deceit called, I think it started in the 1800s, and a friend of mine, Dr. Alicia Simmons, has written an incredible book called Courting that I really recommend to you, that looks at the tort of deceit. It's the most engaging, beautiful, scholarly work. I think it's just been nominated for the Prime Minister's Literary Prize. But she talks at length about this tort of deceit, and it's about emotional damage, and it acknowledged that the emotions can be damaged as well as your finances. And my understanding from Alicia is that it was abolished in, I think, the 1970s. So it actually was there till quite recently. I would love lawyers to look at what is possible in this space for law reform. And I think also in America there is some movement to look at consent laws and to alter consent laws so that if free and willing consent to a sexual relationship can only be given if the disclosure is honest. I'm not explaining this very well at all, but do you know have you heard of this?
Absolutely.
Can you explain what I mean?
There's been discussion in the UK as well, kind of around, you have consented to an intimate relationship, but you consented under the kind of false pretenses.
Thank you.
So, deceit. So, I feel that there's potentially new rabbit holes that I'm going to head down as a researcher for my ever-growing list of potential projects. Any final thoughts, Phoebe?
I guess I was just thinking, about the genre true crime and what a lot of the filmmakers I spoke to for the book project that I worked on said, funnily enough, a lot of filmmakers felt like, it was the death of the golden age of documentary filmmaking is true crime kind of thing, because it can be done fast and cheaply kind of thing. It can be done, kind of en masse kind of thing. It's extremely popular. and it can be kind of almost like in a sensational pulpy style kind of thing, which is a little bit unfortunate. Rather than money being invested in more investigative, long-form kind of carefully crafted filmmaking. So I guess that, from my perspective, and probably from the perspective from a lot of the filmmakers I've talked to, the more that filmmakers can be supported through the media landscape to work on these more deeper, longer, better crafted kind of works. I mean, they're happy about that. Like everyone wants to do good work kind of thing. It's sort of a little bit soul destroying to do something that's just a quick kind of, out there on Instagram kind of post kind of thing that's not very insightful or helpful even kind of thing. So I think that is something that, again, needs to sort of happen more at a kind of meta level, I guess, rather than a micro level. Yeah.
Thank you. We are heading towards the end of our time. Do we have any questions, Bridget, online? Okay. Questions in the room. I can see Gina's got her hand up. So have we got a roving mic, Bridget? If you could maybe just introduce yourself before you ask a question. Yep.
Hello, thank you. I'm Dr. Gina Masterton. I am a lawyer and a researcher in the Centre for Justice, and I want to thank you all for this. It's been amazing and illuminating and confirming. And I have a question for Stephanie. You actually interviewed me last year about my PhD on the Hague Child Abduction Convention and said, I'm writing this book. We started talking about narcissists, and we're like, narcissists, and yes, and there's all these, we had this conversation, and then you told me all about it. I bought the book. Congratulations, so brave, so courageous. I actually wanted to rent a few billboards and put my story up there in a picture about my narcissist, but then, I didn't think he was going to be worth the cost, and I didn't know if I could find anybody to do that because exposure is all you can do when, like you're saying, there are no laws around this, when you have your trust, stripped from you and, all this kind of thing. But my question is about the book, so great, wonderfully written, even about your childhood and your mum and how, a lot of mothers can, set us up to be vulnerable in a way that we, and even just being women, just, because of our gender, we're vulnerable towards looking for acceptance, to be seen, to be heard, and what has been created in our culture for men to be the knight in shining armour to come in and validate us when we are, already educated, smart, intelligent, successful, good women, anyway, but we still, there's something in us that does look for that. So, but what I really liked was the romance and how you wrote about the romance. So we're not, just women who come in and get conned by, expert con men. We experience this romance and these, and what you did write was fabulous. I wish you'd written more. Maybe you can go into writing more about that because you've really tapped into it. And I got really into it and like, oh, is that all
I think that's
now?
a bit of a hard no up here. That's okay.
Well, not about that experience, but I mean, you really, you did show that, it wasn't just about, that we come in and we're blindly taken advantage of. I mean, these men are exceptionally good at tapping into our emotions and manipulating our emotions and, throwing us a crumb when we need it. When you could never saw his house. You never even went to his house.
Because he always had an incredibly good reason.
Yeah.
I think that's all.
Yeah,
It's
so
coming.
I
He always
guess
had an incredibly good reason why I couldn't see the house. Really, my mother's coming to stay.
Yes.
It's being renovated. It's the children don't. The biggest one was the children don't want you there yet.
Yeah.
They're because we went through the bruising divorce.
Yeah.
It's been our cocoon through this incredibly difficult time.
Yeah.
It's their house as much as mine. Like, what reasonable person argues with that?
I mean, that's really plausible, and I think that's the challenge in all
Yeah.
of this. That
and you don't want to doubt the person because you love them.
Yeah.
So I mean, like my question is there a way when we do see red flags or we have this little voice going, maybe I'll just do a drop in or a pop in, and
Exactly, and that would change everything, wouldn't it?
and but do we want to know? So my question is, what is there something in us when we're in this where we're like, and you said I could have done more investigating, but I probably didn't want to know. What is that in us, and how can, when that starts to come up, we go, well, I could ask that question or I could try to find out, but I don't really want to know because I don't want to lose this. I mean...
Yeah, it's incredibly tricky.
Yeah.
There was certainly a part of me that didn't want to know.
Yeah.
And I could have averted so much heartbreak if I had just gone, I need to know. It's going to be hard, whatever I discover, but it will save me a lot of time and a lot of emotion. And I didn't do that.
Is this something we should be telling younger women? You know,
I think
not
so.
bad-mouthing men.
I think so, but I think
you know.
the more important message possibly is, particularly women, and we've talked in here today about male perpetrators of this sort of behaviour. Women are capable of this as well.
Very much so.
And it happens in same-sex relationships. It's not confined. It's not just evil men that do this. I should acknowledge that, but certainly the messages that I've had over the years have predominantly come from women talking about men. They're the stories I hear, and I think. My guess is, and I don't know that there's any data on this, but my guess is that it would be a very high proportion would be men hurting women in these scams. And I think that what you referred to, the princess myth, the stories that women are told from a really, really young age, that blokes just don't get. And I suspect they're probably not really even aware of what their sisters or are getting in the way of messaging from society, from their mothers, from their families, from the media. It's just relentless. And so I think it lays even now, and I don't have children, but I suspect even now, young girls are getting these messages in various ways. But I think that lays the path for women to accept less than they should accept. And I think the most important message for young girls to be given is do not ever, ever accept treatment that you would not give to someone else. Do not let yourself be treated poorly.
Or allow yourself to question. You know, if you have allow yourself to question him a little further, or or whoever it is.
Yeah.
To not just be accepting and to not go to his office ever. I mean, dude, I would have been like, if I was I'm sure there were reasons around that, but I mean, for someone to drive you to work and he has his office but to never see it, I mean, they just create this illusion so well that you never think to question it and go, well, I'm going to come in and see where you work. And I want to
think
see.
it just, what you're highlighting, Gina, is just the challenge that
Yeah.
we face in this space, that the reasons why it is so difficult. In terms of the stats, we do know that women report higher financial losses for romance fraud, that men report higher losses around investment. But I would also say my observations from talking to both men and women across the years is that kind of the narrative and the stories and circumstances that they're presented with are very different. And I think that just highlights the different vulnerabilities that we all have. Everyone in this room has a vulnerability, but it's going to be entirely different. And what's successful for one person is going to be unsuccessful for someone else. And that is, I think, some of the challenges around prevention, because there's not kind of one unique message.
I was just going to talk about betrayal blindness, which is a psychological phenomena. And Elodie, I don't know her last name, she wrote a book called Duped. And there was a study done in that whereby it was something like 90% of the people in the survey that were told about the fact that they were being scammed or duped still went ahead with the relationship, the transaction, whatever it was they were researching. And I've been talking a lot to the banks at the moment, heads of fraud, and they're doing some incredible work from a technical perspective, using AI, etc. But a lot of the feedback coming from there is when the banks try and stop a transaction happening and then they reach out to the victim and let them know, the disproportionate number of victims that will not take their advice. And legally in Australia, banks have to honour a transaction that's requested by a customer. So they actually don't have the ability to stop a transaction if the customer has authorised it. But to the point where they talk about some people who are being scammed, that get contacted by the bank, you're about to be scammed, do not transfer the money, that the victim actually tries to convince the call centre person of the investment opportunity. So there is a psychological phenomena of betrayal. It's called betrayal blindness, where a little bit like you actually don't want to believe it's true, but you are so convinced because the psychological tactics that have been used against you, where they elicit an emotion, fear, love, or excitement generally, And then you layer over the top of that emotion some situational vulnerability. So you might have just had a baby and you're tired, or you might be an international, CEO of an international company and you're jet lagged, whatever it might be. It is the perfect scenario for a scammer to get you. And so it's just so layered and so nuanced. And I think accessing your rational thinking or your logical thinking in that moment, there's so many things that our brains are doing that is working against us.
The other emotion, of course, is hope. And there's something, I was listening to an ABC radio program a few years ago, possibly while I was writing the book, and they were interviewing victim survivors of domestic violence, and one of the women said, the old question, why don't you just leave? Why don't you just leave? And there are very many complex reasons why women don't just leave, including their personal safety. It's the most dangerous time for a woman to leave a relationship. But this particular woman said, I was addicted to hope. And I think that's a very human... Remember, we're talking about the deepest of human emotions, love and romance and sex and intimacy. These are just deeply, deeply biologically wired things. And hope is enormously powerful.
And I reflect back on my time in this space. When I first started, romance fraud was probably about 5% of kind of the fraud statistics around, the known ones that were being reported. It was all the kind of the advance fee fraud, your investment, the Nigerian kind of type of fraud. But I think offenders very quickly learned that the most effective way to manipulate and deceive anyone is through kind of a personal relationship. And since then, we've seen romance fraud figures just explode, and just this escalation in terms of the human connection. We all want to have this human connection. We all want to have a relationship with someone, whether it's romantic or not. And offenders have certainly grasped onto that. They've leveraged that to their success. And it's really quite challenging. I've got one question here, and then we might have to wrap up. I'm sorry, Larry. We might have to wrap up just in the room. If you could introduce yourself and say your question,
Hello.
please.
I'm Barbara. I'm a cybersecurity analyst. And I actually have two questions, but we'll see how we go for time.
Yep.
The first one's a bit two-pronged for Steph and Tracy. But I feel like in popular media nowadays, there's a bit of a trend of romanticizing villains, especially by casting attractive male leads usually. I apologize, I actually haven't seen the show, but I guarantee you I will be rectifying that.
Anymore, it's not mine.
But
There's no judgment here on that.
I feel like a lot of people might say that David Wyndham is a good-looking fellow. He's obviously been cast in a lot of popular roles.
He doesn't look very good-looking in this.
Well, so I haven't seen it. But was that a bit of a worry for you? I look at him and I see Faramir, so he's forever Faramir for me. So were you a little bit worried that your perpetrator was perhaps going to be romanticized, if not by the show, then by the audiences? Because that tends to happen nowadays, and it seems to be encouraged by social culture.
Well, as I said earlier, there were things I wasn't happy about, but I wasn't unhappy with the dramatisation. It is entertainment. I knew that they have to sell it to the streaming services. It's not a commercial proposition if they don't. It's not meant to be a public service. It is meant to be entertainment. And also the challenge is you've got to make a character that the show is called Fake, so the audience knows from the very beginning that there's something going to happen here and that this bloke is not who he says he is. But you have to make them a believable character. You've got to make it understandable to the audience. Why is Ashley Ketty falling in love with David Wenham's character? And that's a really tricky line to walk when you declare straight up front that this show is called Fake. There's no doubt about that he is fake. So how are you going to make that character as believable as you possibly can? And I think that's the challenge that they mostly met.
Yeah.
I don't know whether that answers your question
No,
to a point. It is a drama. It's
But
entertainment.
did you feel empowered at least, let's say there's a bit of controversy now, It Ends With Us, the Colleen Hoover movie, which is about domestic violence, and some people feel that the promo for the movie is romanticizing it a little bit, and one side of it is going, no, this is actually quite a serious story and we don't really want to glorify the good-looking male lead. Did you feel empowered to make sure that the messaging around the show
I didn't have any power. Quite simply, there was no power.
Yeah.
I had to go with what they went with. yeah,
You
I
trusted
didn't
your
really, I
production
didn't
company
really
at
think
least?
about it, to be very honest. I too many other things to sort of occupy my fears. Yeah,
That's fine.
I mean, I think that does just highlight the challenge that Phoebe talked about in terms of director decisions and documentary makers' decisions about how they will portray it. I was pretty frustrated with the way that Simon was portrayed in The Tinder Swindler, if I'm honest. And I know that there's been some robust discussions kind of around how that occurred. But again, that's kind of just personal. Like, people will see and interpret the characters in different ways. We all have different tastes when it comes to television and what we like. I'm really sorry, but we're just going to have to wrap it up there because we are over time. Just to wrap up, I would very much like to thank everyone. For those of you in the room today, thank you so much for braving traffic and making time to come to this. A huge shout out to those that are online. Thank you very much for joining in. I hope this conversation was just as, it was such a beautiful conversation. For those of you in the room, we do have some lunch, so feel free to grab that. We also have copies of both The Last Victim and Fake, which you can purchase, and Stephanie and Tracy will be able to sign them for you. I guess just going away from today, I'd really just give everyone the challenge to go home and to talk about this, because I think what we've learned today and the theme of National Scams Awareness Week is to share a story. And I think the more that we can break down the stigma, break down the shame, bring this into the open, bring this into our normal conversations with our family, with our friends, for me, that's the biggest message that I can leave you with. I'd very much like to give a shout out to my Centre for Justice colleagues, so Bridget, who's been running around, Sarah Kramer, thank you so much for your support, and for Rowena as well for sponsoring this event. Thank you very much. So if we can just show our appreciation with a round of applause. Thank you very much.